Then don't delete the night logs. Naomi Brooks said it so quietly that at first no one was sure she had spoken at all. The words seemed too small for a lobby that grand, too steady for a woman being dismissed in front of half the executive floor. But once they landed, they changed the air. Grant Whitmore stood near the marble reception desk with one hand buttoned over his suit jacket, his expression carved into the kind of calm that made other people nervous. Behind him, the company logo glowed in brushed steel across a wall of backlit stone, cold and expensive, the kind of backdrop meant to make power look permanent. Linda Pierce from Human Resources stood off to the side with a folder pressed flat against her chest, her heels clicking once as she shifted her weight. A security guard waited by the glass turnstiles, not unkind, just practiced. Naomi held her employee badge between two fingers. The plastic edge caught the white lobby light for a second, flashing like a small piece of ice. She was still in her navy cardigan, still wearing the same low black flats she wore every day, still carrying that plain canvas tote no one in the office had ever really noticed. Around them, people slowed without stopping. Assistants with laptops hugged to their ribs. Analysts pretending to check phones. A man from accounting lingering too long near the coffee kiosk. Nobody wanted to stare, but nobody wanted to miss it either. Grant's voice had filled the room a moment earlier, measured and final. We need employees who communicate, who integrate, who know how to function as part of a team. Naomi had listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her shoulders straight. She had not pleaded. She had not asked for another chance. That almost seemed to bother Linda more than anything. There was something about quiet dignity that made confident people feel accused. Through the 40-foot windows, rain feathered down over the city in thin gray lines, blurring the traffic below into red and white streaks. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish, printer toner, and the burnt edge of lobby coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate too long. Naomi looked not at Linda, but at Grant. Just once. Her eyes were dark, calm, and tired in a way that suggested she had been carrying something heavy for a long time without letting anyone see the weight of it. Grant extended his hand for the badge. She placed it in his palm. It was such a small motion, almost polite, but the whole lobby seemed to tighten around it. Linda opened the folder to review the exit terms, already moving toward the next step, the next form, the next neat corporate erasure. That was when Naomi spoke. Then don't delete the night logs. Linda frowned first, a quick little crease between her brows. Grant's fingers closed around the badge, but not all the way. For 1 second, even the security guard looked up. Naomi adjusted the strap of her tote on her shoulder, as if she had said something ordinary, something obvious, something any reasonable person would understand. But no one did. Not yet. Grant's jaw shifted almost imperceptibly. What night logs? He asked. Naomi glanced past him toward the private elevators, toward the hall that led to records and compliance, toward the places nobody important ever walked after 6 o'clock. When she answered, her voice was even softer than before, and somehow that made it hit harder. The ones that show who was still working after everyone else went home. For a moment, nobody moved. The lobby lights hummed softly above them, pale against the rain-dark glass, and the silence that followed Naomi's words felt strangely heavier than the conversation that had come before. Linda let out a short breath through her nose, the kind people used when they wanted to signal impatience without fully losing control. Night logs, she repeated, as if saying the phrase out loud might make it sound less absurd. Grant did not answer her. His eyes stayed on Naomi, not warm, not hostile, just narrowed now with the first hint of attention he had given her all morning. It was the kind of attention powerful men reserved for things that might become inconvenient. Behind the reception desk, the young woman at the front computer stopped typing. Somewhere deeper in the building, an elevator chimed, and the sound seemed too cheerful for the tension spreading through the room. Naomi shifted her tote higher on her shoulder. The canvas strap had worn pale at the edges, and one corner of a yellow legal pad peeked out from the top. Grant noticed that too. He had seen her with that bag for months. Maybe longer, and never once asked what was inside it. You were saying you stayed in the building after hours, he said at last. Naomi met his gaze without flinching. I am saying someone did. Linda gave a quick, humorless laugh. This is not the time for riddles. If you have something to say it clearly. Naomi turned her head slightly toward her, but not enough to make it disrespectful. I tried that once, she said. No one called me back. A few feet away, Marcus Reed stood near the security gate with one hand resting on the scanner post. He worked evenings more than mornings, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and a patient face, the kind people overlooked because he did not insist on being noticed. But he knew Naomi. Not well, maybe, but enough to recognize the way she moved through the building after most of the staff had gone home. Quiet, careful, sometimes with a banker's box in her arms, sometimes with a stack of files hugged tight against her cardigan, sometimes with that same legal pad tucked under one elbow. He had buzzed her into records on the 31st floor more than once. Always with authorization. Always late. Grant finally looked toward Marcus. Did she stay after hours? Marcus hesitated, not because he did not know, but because he understood what truth could cost in rooms like this. The scanner light blinked green against his sleeve. Yes, sir, he said carefully. A lot of nights. Usually after 8. Sometimes later. Linda turned so fast her folder slipped against her arm. Why was that not flagged? Marcus kept his tone level. Because she had access approval from compliance, ma'am. Linda's mouth tightened. Grant's fingers flexed once around Naomi's badge. The edges pressed into his palm, hard enough to leave a mark that would disappear in minutes. Compliance, he repeated. Naomi nodded. The rain outside thickened, dragging silver lines down the glass in slow, crooked trails. It made the city beyond look distant, almost underwater. Grant stepped closer, lowering his voice, and somehow that made the scene feel sharper, not softer. What exactly are these logs supposed to show? Naomi looked past him again, toward the elevators, toward the upper floors where the windows went black one by one after dusk. Her answer came slowly, like something measured and deliberate, something she had decided long ago. She would not rush for anyone. They show badge entries, archive access, print history, file recovery requests, and who kept turning off the cameras outside records between 9:15 and 9:20 every Thursday night. This time the silence did not feel awkward. It felt dangerous. Linda's face lost a little color. Marcus straightened, and for the first time that morning, Grant Whitmore did not look like a man ending a problem. He looked like a man realizing one had just begun. Grant did not tell Naomi to leave after that. He glanced once at the front desk, once at Linda, then toward the bank of private elevators, and the decision passed across his face like a shade being drawn. Conference room B, he said. Now. Linda opened her mouth as if to object, then closed it just as quickly. Marcus stepped aside from the turnstile, and Naomi walked forward without hurry, her flats making almost no sound on the polished stone. The elevator ride was short, but the silence inside it felt stretched thin. Linda held her folder too tightly. Grant watched the floor numbers rise. Naomi stood nearest the brushed steel wall, her tote still on her shoulder, her expression calm in the way still water looks calm right before rain starts hitting it. On the 32nd floor, the doors opened to a corridor of glass offices and framed awards. Conference room B sat at the far end, all cool lighting and pale oak, with a 12-seat table that always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and expensive coffee. Naomi remained standing after they entered. No one asked whether she wanted to sit. That did not seem to surprise her. Grant took the head of the table. Linda stood beside him, flipping open her folder more for comfort than need. Through the glass wall, junior staff passed by more slowly than usual, pretending to check messages while trying to see in. Naomi set her tote down gently by one chair, but kept her hand resting on it, as if it contained something steadier than the room around her. Up close, the details that most people ignored were harder to miss. The clean cuffs on her cardigan, even though the fabric had begun to pill. The careful way she had mended one loose seamed near the pocket with dark thread that almost matched. The faint shadows beneath her eyes. The small crescent mark on her right thumb from years of handling paper, binder clips, and dry file tabs. She had been with Whitmore Holdings for 11 months and 2 weeks. Most people would not have known that. Most people only knew her as the quiet one from records, the black woman who ate lunch at odd hours, who never joined birthday cakes in the break room, who always seemed to appear near the archive elevators with a stack of folders and disappear before anyone thought to ask what she was doing. Linda had once described her as difficult to read. Another employee had called her cold. One analyst, careless enough to say it where Marcus could hear, had said she moved through the building like she was trying to prove she belonged there. None of them had bothered to notice the smaller truths. Naomi always returned misfiled documents without making anyone look foolish. She left sticky notes with corrected account numbers in neat block letters and no signature. She refilled the copier paper and records when the night crew got backed up. She remembered which temp workers were covering extra shifts and quietly set aside the forms they would need in the morning so they would not get blamed for delays they did not cause. She was not unfriendly. She was careful. There was a difference, and almost nobody in that building had respected it. Grant folded his hands on the table. "Start at the beginning," he said. Naomi looked at him for a moment, then at the rain slipping down the window beyond his shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was steady, almost plain, but it carried in the room with the kind of clarity that did not need volume. "The beginning," she said, "was the first Thursday I stayed late and realized I was not the only one who had a reason not to go home. It had been raining that night, too. Not hard, just steady enough to turn the city outside the record's floor into a blur of silver and red. Naomi had stayed because the stack on her desk was taller than usual, and because going home to her apartment before 10 o'clock meant listening to the radiator hiss in an empty room while the woman upstairs paced until midnight. Work was quieter. Work had structure. The record's floor after hours smelled like dust, old paper, and the faint metallic chill of recycled air. Most of the lights had already dimmed to energy-saving mode, leaving long strips of white across the carpet and shadow pooling in the corners by the archive doors. Naomi had been cross-checking benefit files, page by page, because the digital summaries were not matching the originals. Dates were off. Approval stamps were missing. A reimbursement request marked complete in the system had no signed authorization in the paper file. At first she thought it was clerical sloppiness, the kind that happened in any large company where too many departments touched the same forms and no one wanted responsibility for the gaps. Then she found 3 employee appeals in 1 week, all marked closed in the database, all still sitting in the unresolved bin in hard copy. One belonged to a janitor recovering from knee surgery. One belonged to a woman in shipping whose diabetic medication had been delayed twice. One belonged to a night maintenance worker who had written his daughter's name in the margin of a form in small, careful letters, as if that might remind someone reading it that a real family was waiting on the other side of corporate delay. Naomi had stared at those pages a long time. The overhead vent rattled softly above her. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator opened and closed. She had thought she was alone until the security cameras outside records blinked off for exactly 5 minutes. She noticed because the little monitor on the side desk went dark, then returned, then went dark again the next Thursday at the same time. 9:15 to 9:20. Just enough for someone who knew the floor plan. Just enough to move without questions. When she checked the system access the next morning, the print queue had been wiped clean for that window, but the recovery cache still held fragments. File names, partial timestamps, benefit appeals, medical reimbursements, denied dependents. She began staying later after that, telling no one. Not because she wanted to play detective, but because she had spent her whole life watching people with polished voices explain away harm that never touched them directly. At Whitmore Holdings, the people on the top floors talked about efficiency the way pastors talked about salvation. Grant Whitmore especially. He had built a reputation on clean presentations, sharp forecasts, and a kind of disciplined charm that made investors trust him before he finished a sentence. When he walked through the building, assistants stood straighter. Managers adjusted their tone. Men who had not looked at each other all morning suddenly found reasons to nod. Linda Pierce carried that same culture in a different shape. Not elegant, exactly. Precise. She liked records that aligned, people who smiled on cue, and staff meetings where everyone knew their place before the first slide came up. Naomi had learned quickly that quiet from a black woman was read differently in rooms like that. In some people it looked focused. In her it looked suspicious. In others it meant thoughtful. In her it meant distant, difficult, not quite teen material. So she said less and watched more. She logged what she saw in neat handwriting on yellow legal pads. She copied file numbers by hand when the system did not make sense. She saved what could be saved. And on the 3rd Thursday, when the cameras clicked off again and footsteps passed the archive corridor after 9:15, Naomi finally understood 2 things at once. Someone inside the company was erasing more than paperwork, and if she brought it up too early, The wrong people would make sure the truth disappeared before daylight ever reached it. Grant said nothing for several seconds after Naomi finished. Rain tapped softly against the glass wall behind him, a thin, patient sound, and the conference room seemed to shrink around it. Linda shifted her folder again, but this time the paper inside made a dry, unsteady whisper, not the crisp, efficient snap she usually carried into meetings. "You still should have reported it through the proper channels," she said, though even she sounded less certain now. Naomi looked at her with the same calm she had worn downstairs, but up close there was something else in her face now, something older than fear and heavier than nerves. "I did," she said. "Once." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Grant leaned back an inch in his chair. "To whom?" Naomi reached into her tote and pulled out the yellow legal pad they had both noticed in the lobby. It was worn at the corners and thick with use, pages bent from being carried back and forth for weeks. She opened it carefully, not theatrically, just like someone handling something that had cost her too much time to lose. Between columns of dates and file numbers, one page held a copied email subject line in neat block letters. Records discrepancy in Employee Benefits Archive. Under it was a date from 6 weeks earlier. Submitted through internal compliance. Forwarded to Human Resources Review. Linda's eyes dropped to the page, then lifted again too fast. "That was a routine inquiry," she said. "We received dozens." Naomi nodded once. "Yes. Mine came back closed in under 9 minutes. Marcus, who had remained near the door after escorting them in, frowned slightly. 9 minutes was not enough time to open a file, much less understand one. Naomi turned another page. There was a handwritten list of badge access entries, then a second list of corresponding document recovery requests, then a third list of employee names with red dots beside the ones whose physical files did not match their digital status. Some of the names had short notes beside them. "Daughter needs insulin refill. Follow-up surgery denied twice. Appeal marked complete, but never reviewed." The room changed as those words appeared. It no longer felt like a disagreement about procedure. It felt like somebody had opened a window in winter. "I kept looking because the patterns were too clean," Naomi said. "Too consistent. Whole sections were missing only from lower wage claims. Night shift workers, contract staff, warehouse families, janitorial support, people who do not usually know which office to call twice, let alone 3 times. Her voice did not rise. That made it worse somehow, the steadiness of it, the lack of self-pity. People in power often expected pain to arrive loudly so they could dismiss it as emotion. Naomi brought hers in neat lines and dates. Grant stared at the legal pad as if it had become something alive on his table. "Why not come to me directly?" Naomi met his eyes then, and for the first time since entering the room, there was a sharpness in her expression. "Because men like you always say your door is open," she said, "but there is usually a woman outside it deciding who sounds credible before the handle ever turns." Linda inhaled sharply. Marcus looked down. Grant did not speak. Naomi lowered her gaze back to the page. "I knew what I would look like," she continued. "Quiet black woman from records. No management title. No polished language. No room. Full of people ready to repeat what I said after I said it. If I came too early, I would be called confused. If I pushed too hard, I would be called difficult. If I got emotional, I would be called unstable. So I waited until the pattern could not be explained away." She slid the legal pad a few inches forward across the table. Her fingers were steady, but there was exhaustion in the movement now, the kind that comes from carrying something alone for too long. "I was not staying late because I love the work," she said softly. "I was staying because every time I almost stopped, I found another name that should have mattered to somebody." The room stayed still long enough for the rain to become noticeable again. It traced the glass in slow, crooked lines, turning the skyline beyond the conference floor into something soft and far away, as if the city itself were listening from a distance. Linda recovered first. She straightened her shoulders, pressed her folder flat against the table, and reached for the one defense people like her always trusted most when facts began slipping out of their control. "If you were tracking badge entries, print histories, and recovery caches on your own," she said, "then you were operating outside your job description." Naomi did not blink. "I was doing the part of the job that still had a conscience," she said. Linda's face hardened. "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I have left," Naomi replied. Grant lifted a hand before Linda could fire back. His watch caught the overhead light, a brief clean flash against the dark wood table. "Did you copy any protected files?" he asked. Naomi rested both hands on the back of the chair in front of her. "Not the files themselves," she said. "Just the numbers attached to them. Dates, locations, change logs. Enough to tell when a document moved, when a decision changed, and when a closed case kept breathing after the system said it was dead." Grant's gaze dropped to the legal pad again. The pages were filled with careful lines, names and times arranged with a kind of discipline that felt almost old-fashioned in a building that trusted screens more than paper. Marcus shifted near the door. He had seen Naomi in the records wing with that pad tucked under her arm so many times that the sight of it now felt less like evidence and more like memory finally getting permission to speak. Linda reached for the conference phone. "I am calling information security," she said. "If there has been unauthorized tracking, I want a full review of her login history and file access before we entertain any more accusations." Naomi nodded as if she had expected that exact move. "Good," she said quietly. "Ask them for the Thursday night remote restores too." Linda paused with her hand over the phone. Grant looked up. "Remote restores," he repeated. Naomi drew a slow breath. Cold air hummed through the vent above them. There was a faint smell of fresh coffee drifting in from the hallway, but in that room it only made the silence sharper. "Every Thursday after the cameras outside records went dark," she said, "deleted claims were reopened from backup for about 4 minutes. Then they were altered and closed again. Not removed. Adjusted. Dates changed. Dependent names dropped. Appeal language replaced. That way, if anyone audited the file later, it looked processed instead of ignored." Marcus frowned. "That would take system access above records level," he said. Naomi nodded. "Yes, and payroll coordination." Linda laughed once, but there was no ease in it now. "That is an extraordinary claim." Naomi turned her head toward her. "So is firing someone for being quiet when you never once checked what she was staying quiet about?" Grant's jaw tightened. The conference phone sat between them like something loaded. Finally, he pressed the speaker button himself and gave a clipped order to pull 6 weeks of after-hours access data, archive camera interruptions, print queue wipes, and all remote restore activity linked to employee benefit files. He spoke without raising his voice, but everybody in the room heard the shift. This was no longer a routine dismissal. It was an opening. Naomi picked up her tote and slid one hand inside. For a moment, Linda looked almost relieved, as if she expected a mistake. Something improper, something she could seize and hold up like a shield. What Naomi pulled out instead was a slim manila envelope, edges softened from being carried too long. She set it on the table in front of Grant with almost tender care. On the front, written in the same neat block letters as the legal pad, were 7 words that made even Linda stop breathing for a second. Names they changed after the workers died. No one reached for the envelope right away. It sat in the center of the conference table beneath the cold recessed lights, thin and ordinary, the kind of office packet people passed around every day without thinking, and yet the room seemed to lean away from it, as if paper itself had suddenly become dangerous. Grant was the one who finally touched it. He slid one finger beneath the flap and opened it with the careful restraint of a man trying not to reveal that his pulse had changed. Inside were photocopied claim summaries, printed death notices, archived payroll corrections, and a page Naomi had typed herself in clean black letters, each line pairing an employee name with a later file modification date. The first name on the list belonged to Daniel Ruiz, a loading dock supervisor who had died 8 months earlier after a delayed procedure. According to the system, his dependent care appeal had been corrected 2 days after his death. The second belonged to Marlene Shaw from custodial support. Her file had been reopened after she was gone, not to approve the medication request she had submitted, but to remove her grandson from the dependent section entirely. By the 3rd page, even the air in the room felt thinner. Linda stared down at the documents, then back at Naomi, and something flinty came into her expression, not guilt exactly, but the hard reflex of someone whose authority had started slipping and who intended to grab anything she could before it fell out of reach. "This could still be misinterpreted," she said. "Retroactive corrections happen. Survivor status updates happen. Beneficiary changes happen after death." Naomi did not move. "Yes," she said. "Honest ones do." Linda lifted one sheet, as though she could shake certainty loose from it. And what exactly qualifies you to make that distinction? The question landed with more than one meaning in it. Naomi heard that. So did Marcus. So did Grant, though he kept his face still. Naomi rested her fingertips lightly on the edge of the chair back in front of her. I know the difference between an update and an erasure, she said. I know what it looks like when a system corrects a date. I also know what it looks like when someone removes a child from a file so the payout drops below review level. Grant's eyes rose sharply at that. Before Linda could answer, the conference phone crackled to life. Information security was on the line. A man's voice, brisk and too neutral, began reading preliminary findings. 6 weeks of Thursday camera interruptions confirmed. Archive corridor feed lost from 9:15 to 9:20 on 5 separate nights. Print queue deletions confirmed. Remote restore activity confirmed. 3 user credentials involved. 1 from payroll coordination. 1 from benefits administration. The 3rd from human resources supervisory review. The room went still in a different way this time. Marcus looked at Linda first. Naomi did not. She kept her eyes on Grant because this was the moment that mattered, the thin edge where powerful men decided whether truth would be cleaned up or finally looked at in daylight. Linda set the paper down too quickly. There has to be some mistake, she said, but the clean control had gone out of her voice now. Grant did not respond. He was staring at the page in his hand, at the columns Naomi had built in silence while everyone else was busy deciding what kind of woman she was. Outside the glass wall, the hallway had quieted. The whole floor seemed to know something had cracked. Naomi picked up her tote at last, as if she had already prepared herself for the possibility that even now the truth might not be enough. Grant noticed the motion and looked up. Are you leaving? He asked. Naomi met his gaze, tired but steady. You already asked me to, she said. I just needed to make sure the dead were not erased before I walked out. Grant rose so suddenly that the leather chair behind him rolled back an inch and tapped the glass wall with a dull, restrained sound. Stay, he said. It was not a request, and yet it lacked the easy authority his voice had carried all morning. Naomi paused with her tote in hand, but did not return to the table. For a moment she simply stood there, framed by the pale conference room light, rain silvering the windows behind her, the soft knit of her cardigan darkening at the shoulders where damp from the lobby had not fully dried. Linda found her voice first, though it came thinner now. Grant, we need legal. Before we do anything reckless. He did not look at her. Marcus, he said, called building access and lockdown records, payroll, and benefits administration. No one enters, no one leaves, and no one touches a file. Marcus nodded once and stepped into the hallway with his phone already in hand. The quiet that followed felt stripped down to essentials. The hum of the air vent, the hiss of rain, the faint electric buzz from the speakerphone still glowing in the center of the table. Grant turned back to Naomi. You said you waited because you needed a pattern no one could explain away, he said. That implies you found more than what is in that envelope. Naomi studied him for a second, as if weighing whether this was curiosity, damage control, or the first honest question he had asked her all day. Then she bent, lifted her tote from the chair, and set it carefully on the table. There is something else, she said. Linda stiffened. If you withheld evidence while employed here, Naomi's eyes moved to her, calm and flat as winter glass. I withheld it from the people most likely to bury it. That is different. Grant said nothing. Naomi reached into the tote again, and this time pulled out a ring of keys, a folded visitor map, and a white access card with a temporary sticker across the front. Marcus had once signed the card out to a vendor who never showed. Naomi laid it beside the legal pad. On the 3rd Thursday, she said, when the cameras dropped and the restore logs repeated, I followed the sound instead of the screen. The records corridor on 31 has a service alcove behind the old supply shelves. Most people think it ends at the breaker cabinet. It does not. There is a secondary archive door set into the wall. Unmarked. No department label. No directory listing. Linda laughed under her breath, but there was fear in it now. That space was decommissioned years ago. Naomi shook her head. No, it was hidden. Grant's expression changed at that, only slightly, but enough. He knew the building plans, knew the renovations, knew which areas still existed behind polished walls because he had signed off on enough budgets to remember the bones under the glass. What is in there? He asked. Naomi slid the folded map toward him and tapped. A square in the lower corner with one fingertip. box claim folders, original paper submissions, scans that were never uploaded, return mail from families who kept asking why their appeals had vanished, and a handwritten index someone forgot to shred. Linda's hand went to the edge of the table as if the room had shifted beneath her shoes. That is impossible. Naomi's voice stayed low. No. Impossible would have been all those corrections happening by accident. Grant looked at the map, then at the temporary card, then back at Naomi. Why did you not open it yourself? She gave the smallest pause before answering, and when she did, the words carried the tired honesty of someone who had stopped protecting anyone's comfort. Because if I entered alone and something disappeared, the quiet black woman from records would become the whole story. But if you open it with your own hands, she said, then you will have to decide whether you built a company or just a cleaner version of neglect. Grant did not speak again until the elevator doors opened on 31. By then the floor had emptied into that peculiar after-hours stillness Naomi knew so well, the kind that made every light feel colder and every footstep sound borrowed. Marcus was already there waiting by the records corridor, one hand wrapped around his phone, the other resting near the scanner plate on the wall. The overhead fixtures had dimmed to evening mode, leaving the carpet washed in soft gray strips of light. Somewhere far off, a printer whirred and stopped. The air smelled faintly of dust, paper glue, and the bitter trace of burnt coffee that always seemed to linger after 6. Linda had followed them despite Grant telling her twice to remain upstairs. Her heels clicked too sharply in the quiet, each step carrying the tight, brittle rhythm of someone trying not to unravel in public. Naomi walked slightly behind Grant, not timidly, just carefully, her tote tucked against her side, her eyes fixed ahead on the supply alcove at the end of the corridor. In daylight, it looked like nothing. A narrow recess half hidden by metal shelving, stacked with copier boxes, disinfectant wipes, and old binders no one had touched in years. It was the kind of office corner designed to disappear into the background, which was exactly why it had worked. Grant stopped in front of it and stared for a long second. Naomi stepped forward then and moved one of the old binders aside, revealing a seam in the wall so fine it almost passed for shadow. Below it, near knee height, sat a recessed card reader painted the same dull cream as the molding. Marcus let out a breath under his nose. I have worked this building 5 years, he said quietly, and I never saw that. That was the point, Naomi answered. Grant picked up the temporary access card she had brought and turned it once between his fingers. The plastic looked harmless. Everything dangerous in that company always did. Linda folded her arms tightly across herself. Even if there is a storage room back there, that proves nothing. Naomi did not answer her. She was watching Grant, waiting to see whether he would stop at suspicion or keep going long enough to become accountable to what he found. He slid the card through the reader. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then a muted green light blinked low in the wall, followed by a mechanical click so soft it almost sounded embarrassed. Grant pressed his palm to the hidden panel, and it gave way inward a few inches, releasing a stale pocket of colder air that smelled of cardboard, old toner, and the trapped dryness of a room sealed too long. Marcus reached for the switch just inside the doorway. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and then came alive in a thin pale wash. What they revealed made the whole corridor seem to empty of sound. Banker boxes lined 3 steel racks from floor to ceiling. White labels, red labels, archive claim numbers in black marker. Return mail bundled with rubber bands gone brittle from age. Accordion folders with handwritten notes clipped to the front. A rolling cart stood near the back wall with 2 fresh stacks of documents on it, as if someone had intended to come back later that night and finish the job. Grant stepped inside first, but not with the stride of a man in control. More like someone entering a church after hearing his own name spoken from the pulpit. Naomi stayed at the threshold. She knew what was in there. She had seen enough through the crack 3 Thursdays ago to understand the shape of the truth. But this time, under full light, with witnesses and keycards and breathing men who could no longer say they did not know, the room looked different. Not hidden. Exposed. Grant lifted the top file from the cart, scanned the first page, and went still. Then he turned it toward Marcus without a word. Across the top, above the altered claim data and correction stamps, was a name Naomi had written in her yellow pad weeks earlier. The same one she had circled twice because the widow had called 4 times in 12 days and no one from the company had returned a single message. Daniel Ruiz. Grant took the file back from Marcus with both hands, as if the paper had suddenly gained weight. Under the fluorescent lights, Daniel Ruiz's record looked less like a claim folder and more like a trail someone had tried too hard to smooth over. The original submission sat beneath a revised summary sheet, and the two did not match. Naomi could see it even from the doorway. The dependent care section on the first version listed a wife and one daughter, age 11. On the revised form, the daughter was gone. Not crossed out, not formally amended, simply absent, as if she had never existed in the first place. A reimbursement threshold note had been changed too, dropping the total below the level that required secondary executive review. Grant turned the pages faster now. The faint scrape of paper against paper sounded unnaturally loud in the hidden room. Tucked between the forms was a voicemail transcript from Daniel's widow, printed from a service log and marked unresolved. Her words had been typed by some indifferent software, stripped of tone, but the meaning still came through. She had called to ask why the approval letter had vanished from the portal. She had called again to say the hospital billing office had not been paid. She had called a third time because her daughter's follow-up appointment had been delayed and nobody from Whitmore Holdings had returned her message. On the final page, a bright yellow sticky note clung to the margin in handwriting Naomi recognized from another department. Adjusted after death. Closed quietly. Linda went pale in a way that made her look suddenly older, the careful polish of her office self thinning at the edges. This could have been one rogue employee, she said, but her voice had no floor under it anymore. One person trying to clean up an error. Grant did not look at her. He reached into the next box and pulled another file, then another. Marlene Shaw, Hector Bell, Patrice Givens, all of them lower-wage workers. All of them tied to benefit disputes that had somehow changed shape after it no longer mattered to the company whether the truth hurt anyone living on the top floors. Marcus picked up a return envelope banded to one folder. Across the front, in blue ink softened by handling, a child had written, "Please help my grandma." He set it back down with a care that felt almost reverent. Naomi remained just outside the door, one hand resting lightly on the frame. She did not step deeper into the room. She had crossed enough thresholds alone already. Grant opened a thinner file from the rolling cart and froze again. His face did not collapse or twist. It did something quieter than that. It emptied. Naomi knew why before he said a word. The name on the cover was Ernest Holloway, company driver, retired 3 months before his death. Grant had known him. Everyone on the executive floor knew him. Ernest had driven Grant to airports in snowstorms and shareholder dinners in August heat. He had waited outside hospitals when Grant's father was sick. He had sent a Christmas card every year in handwriting, so neat it looked printed. Grant stared at the page as if memory itself had just reached out from the paper and taken him by the throat. The claim showed that Ernest's cardiac medication extension had been flagged incomplete and then silently closed 48 hours before his final hospital admission. Attached behind it was a note from Ernest himself, polite even then. "I believe there has been a mistake. I have worked for this company 19 years. Please call when someone has a moment." Grant lowered the file very slowly. The fluorescent lights washed the color from his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Naomi had ever heard it. "He called me by name," Grant said, "not really to anyone, and I never even knew he was asking for help." The hidden room fell into a silence so complete that even the fluorescent lights seemed louder than before. They buzzed faintly above the rows of boxes, bleaching the color from every file label and every face. Grant still stood with Ernest Holloway's folder open in his hands, but he was no longer reading it. He was looking through it, past the paper and into something that had finally become impossible to soften with language like oversight or policy or workflow error. Linda remained near the cart, one hand braced against the metal handle, her posture rigid in that brittle way people hold themselves when denial is the last clean shirt left in the closet. Marcus moved slowly along the nearest shelf, reading labels in silence, each name pulling another thread loose. Naomi stayed at the doorway, where the colder air from the hidden room met the stale hallway air outside. She had not crossed fully in because she knew this was the point where the truth either became real or got folded back into procedure. Grant set Ernest's file down with care and reached into the same box again. At the very bottom, under the altered claims and printed call logs, lay a cream-colored envelope with no routing slip and no department stamp. Just one name written across the front in Naomi's neat block letters. Grant Whitmore. He looked at it, then at her. "You wrote this," he said. Naomi nodded once. "Weeks ago. Why did you not send it?" Her eyes dropped briefly to the envelope, then lifted again. "Because I was still deciding whether you were the kind of man who needed proof or the kind who would bury it to protect the people around you." Grant broke the seal with less steadiness than before. Inside was a letter, typed cleanly, with no dramatic language and no wasted sentence. Naomi had laid out the dates of the camera interruptions, the restore windows, the mismatched files, the names that kept appearing in the lower wage brackets, and the reason she had not gone to human resources again. But below all of that, in a final section set apart from the rest, she had written something else. She wrote that the first reason she stayed late was suspicion. The second was anger. But the third was memory. Her mother had once lost 6 weeks of treatment waiting for a benefits correction. Another company kept calling administrative delay until the correction no longer mattered. Naomi had learned then what polished indifference could do. Not with fists. Not with shouting. With hold music. With missing forms. With doors that sounded polite while they stayed closed. In the letter she wrote that she had watched the same machinery here, only quieter, cleaner, better dressed. She wrote that she had not wanted revenge. She wanted names restored, dependents reinstated, widows called back, and the record made honest before another family had to beg a corporation to remember who they were. By the time Grant reached the last page, the room had changed again. This was no longer only about fraud. It was about the shape of neglect and who had been trained to survive it without ever being believed the first time. At the bottom of the final page, Naomi had typed one line and then signed her name beneath it in blue ink. "I stayed silent because I needed the truth to be stronger than your first impression of me." Grant lowered the letter. His throat worked once before any sound came out. Linda looked as though she wanted to speak, but found nothing that would not break apart in her mouth. Marcus turned his eyes toward Naomi, and for the first time that day there was no caution in them, only a quiet kind of respect. Grant looked at Naomi then, really looked, not at her cardigan or her tote or the job title they had used to keep her small, but at the woman who had carried all of this alone while the rest of them mistook her silence for emptiness. When he spoke, his voice had lost the smooth edge it always carried in boardrooms. "I fired the only person in this building who was still acting like these people mattered," he said, and nobody in that room could pretend he was wrong. Grant's words did not echo in the hidden room, but they stayed there all the same, settling over the steel shelves and paper boxes like a second layer of dust that no one could wipe away. Naomi did not answer him right away. She looked at the files, at the labels written in different hands, at the copied forms and return envelopes, and all the small bureaucratic remains of people who had once trusted the company to keep its word. Then she looked back at Grant, and there was no triumph in her face. That was what made the moment harder to bear. She was not enjoying his shame. She was measuring whether it meant anything. Linda finally pulled herself upright from the cart, her voice thin and strained. "We need outside counsel," she said. "We need to contain this before anyone starts making emotional decisions." Marcus turned toward her at that, slowly, like a door opening on old hinges. "Emotional," he repeated. "There are dead employees in these boxes and families who never got called back." Linda did not answer him. She could not. Grant folded Naomi's letter once, carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope as if careless hands would be one insult too many. Then he did something no one in that building had probably seen him do in years. He stepped away from the cart, away from the files, and stopped directly in front of Naomi with nothing between them but a strip of pale floor and the smell of old paper. The overhead lights flattened the lines in his face, making him look older, less polished, more human than the man who had stood in the marble lobby that morning with her badge in his hand. "I was wrong," he said. The sentence was plain. No corporate varnish. No softening phrase around the edges. Naomi held his gaze, but her fingers tightened once on the strap of her tote. "Being wrong is not the hard part," she said quietly. "What happens after is." Grant took that in without arguing. Outside the hidden room, the corridor remained still. Somewhere far off, an elevator opened and closed. The building kept breathing around them, unaware that its clean glass image had just cracked from the inside. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Linda turned so sharply her heel scraped the floor. "Grant, He raised one hand without looking at her, and the gesture stopped her more completely than anger would have. Naomi's eyes moved past him to the shelves again, to the names, the dates, the vanished dependents, the notes written by tired hands asking not for favors, but for fairness. When she spoke, her voice stayed low, but every word landed clean. First, no shredding, no late-night cleanup, no internal language about process failure or unfortunate discrepancies. Say what it was. Second, every altered file gets restored from the original paper copy in this room with independent review, not people reporting to the same chain that hid it. Third, every family gets contacted by a real person within 48 hours. Not an automated message, not a portal update, a voice. Grant nodded once, but Naomi was not finished. Fourth, restitution. Full benefits, full back pay where it applies, full apology in writing. Public. Not because it looks noble, but because quiet harm hides behind private language. Marcus lowered his eyes for a second, the way people do in church when something true has finally been said out loud. Linda looked at Grant as if she no longer recognized the ground under her own career. He did not hesitate this time. Done, he said. Naomi studied him another moment, as if testing whether the word had weight or only polish. Then she reached into her tote one last time and pulled out a folded list of names, pages worn soft at the corners from being read too often. She handed it to him, and his hand shook just once when he took it. These are the people still waiting, she said. I did not stay late to destroy your company. I stayed because somebody had to remember who it was supposed to be. By the next morning, the rain had passed, but the city still looked rinsed clean, every pane of glass outside Whitmore Holdings catching the pale gold of early sunlight like something trying to forgive itself. The building felt different before the workday even began. Not louder, quieter in a more honest way. The kind of quiet that comes after a false story has finally collapsed under its own weight. On the 42nd floor, the executive conference room was full an hour before the first assistant usually arrived. Legal counsel sat at one end of the table with untouched coffee. Outside auditors reviewed copied files under bright lamps. Benefits specialists from an independent firm moved box by box through the hidden archive on 31. Names were being restored. Dependents were being re-entered. Return calls were already going out. Down in the lobby, no one had asked Naomi to surrender her visitor pass again. No one had tried to guide her toward a side entrance. She came in through the front doors just after 8, wearing the same navy cardigan, the same plain flats, her canvas tote resting against her shoulder, and the receptionist who had once looked through her now stood up and said, "Good morning, Ms. Brooks," as if the building had finally remembered how to use her name. Naomi did not smile widely. She only nodded and kept walking. The marble floor reflected the morning light in long pale strips, and for the first time since she had started working there, she did not look like someone moving quietly through another person's power. She looked like she belonged to her own. At 9 o'clock, Grant stood before department heads, payroll staff, managers, and employees from every level of the company. There was no stage lighting, no branded backdrop, no polished investor language. Just a plain conference floor, rows of chairs, and a microphone he barely seemed to need. Linda Pierce was not there. Her access had been suspended before sunrise. 2 others from Benefits Administration were already under formal investigation. Grant spoke without slides, without a legal script in his hand, and without trying to protect himself with the usual clean vocabulary of corporations that wanted forgiveness without confession. He said the company had failed its workers. He said records had been altered. He said families had been ignored. He said the harm fell hardest on the people with the least power to force the system to see them. And then, in front of all of them, he said Naomi Brooks had been right when leadership had chosen not to hear her. Across the room, Naomi sat in the back row beside Marcus, not hidden, not displayed, just present. Sunlight reached through the tall windows and touched one side of her face. She listened without lowering her eyes. When the meeting ended, people did not rush for the doors the way they usually did. Some stayed seated. Some cried quietly. Some simply stared ahead, as if they were trying to understand how many names they had walked past without ever asking what burden those names were carrying. Grant stepped down from the front and crossed the room slowly. He stopped at Naomi's row, but he did not ask for gratitude. He did not ask her to rescue his image or ease his guilt. He only handed her a single sheet of paper. It was the first restored family contact list, already marked completed beside 12 names. Naomi took it, ran her eyes over the page, and exhaled once, softly. Outside the windows, the morning light spread wider across the city. Inside, the room remained still.